The world collapsed around Hana Takahashi with a thunder that shook the ground beneath her feet. The air reeked of smoke and salt, heavy with the sharp echo of gunfire. Palm trees bent under the force of explosions, their fronds falling like broken feathers into the sand. Shouts in languages she half understood, mixed with the metallic roar of engines, and above it all came the steady beat of boots advancing through the chaos. Hana pressed her back against a crumbling wall, clutching the edge of her uniform. The white cloth was smeared with dirt and ash, its once proud symbol of duty stained by panic. She had been tending to the wounded, patching burns and wrapping bandages with trembling hands, when the order to retreat dissolved into screams. Now, surrounded by fear, she realized there was no escape. The enemy had arrived faster than anyone imagined. Beside her, Aiko whimpered, her small body shaking as she tried to cover her face. "Hana, they're coming," she whispered, her voice so thin it almost vanished in the noise. "I know," Hana answered, her voice steadier than she felt. "Stay close. We must not lose each other." Mariko, crouched near them, spat into the dust, her eyes fierce even in terror. "Better death than this humiliation. They will treat us like animals." Hana glanced at her friend, torn between the boldness of those words and the hollow pit in her own chest. She wanted to believe in honor, in the strength of sacrifice, but her hands shook too much to hold such certainty. The ground quaked again, and this time the sound that followed was not distant but near, the tread of men, heavy and unyielding. The first sight of them struck Hana with a jolt. Out of the haze, figures emerged, tall, broad-shouldered, their uniforms drenched in sweat, rifles held steady. Their movements carried a weight that filled the broken street, and for a moment Hana forgot her fear and only stared. These were not shadows of propaganda posters, nor the monstrous caricatures she had been warned of. They were men, larger and louder than she imagined, their presence impossible to ignore. A voice barked in English, sharp and commanding. The words washed over Hana without meaning, but the gesture was clear. Hands up, step forward. One Marine's eyes met hers, not cruel but unyielding, and she felt her breath catch. Around her, the other women obeyed, some weeping openly, others stiff with rage. Hana lifted her trembling arms, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. The march began at once. Boots pressed the dirt, weapons gleamed in the sunlight, and the women shuffled in silence, surrounded by towering figures. Hana felt Aiko's hand clutch hers tightly, the skin cold and clammy. Mariko muttered under her breath, curses in Japanese that the guards likely did not understand, but her tone carried enough venom to speak for itself. Hana kept her eyes on the ground, fighting to breathe through the smell of sweat and smoke. Yet, even in her fear, a strange curiosity stirred within her. The Marines' voices carried laughter between commands, rough and casual, as though the war had not stripped them of every trace of humanity. One of them, with hair the color of sand and eyes the shade of the sea, glanced at her only briefly, but it was enough to unsettle the fragile wall she had built inside herself. A question rose in her mind, unbidden and dangerous. Who were these men beyond the battlefield? She pressed her lips together, shoving it down, because questions had no place in captivity. All that mattered now was survival. Still, she could not forget the way they filled the space around her, shoulders broad against the sunlight, voices echoing like thunder, a force that seemed to crush the remnants of her world. Hana told herself she would endure. That shame could be carried like a hidden scar. Yet as the dust of the road clung to her skin, she knew the days ahead would test her in ways she had never imagined. And so began her march into the unknown. If you are captivated by Hana's first steps into this story, make sure to subscribe for more powerful journeys of resilience and history. The road cut through the jungle like a scar, its dirt pressed down by the boots of soldiers and the bare feet of those forced to walk behind them. The sun bore down with merciless intensity, soaking the women's uniforms until they clung like a second skin. Humidity wrapped around their bodies, thick as a wet blanket, every breath sticky and heavy. Hana Takahashi moved in silence, her hand locked tightly with Aiko's, each step dragging through dust that stung her throat. Around them, the Marines advanced with a discipline that felt unshakable. Their rifles glinted under the light, and their movements seemed choreographed, as though they had rehearsed this march 1,000 times. The women, in contrast, stumbled and swayed, their bodies weakened from days of rationing and fear. Hana's legs trembled, but she forced them forward, determined not to collapse before her captors. Aiko whimpered, clutching her stomach. "I can't keep going, Hana." "My legs won't—" "You must," Hana whispered back quickly, her voice urgent but calm. "Lean on me if you have to. Just don't stop." Mariko, walking a few paces ahead, shot them both a glance, her lips twisted in disdain. "They would rather see us crawl. Don't give them the satisfaction." Her words carried defiance, but Hana could hear the strain beneath them. The heat rose in waves from the ground, distorting the horizon. Hana's thoughts swirled with confusion as she studied the Marines around them. Their strides were longer, stronger, their bodies broad and unyielding against the oppressive air. She had grown up believing these men were beasts, faceless and cruel. Yet as one of them adjusted his pace to steady the group's rhythm, she wondered if monsters would bother. "Eyes forward," one of the Marines barked. The tone was harsh, but not laced with mockery. Hana obeyed, though her gaze strayed for a moment to his shoulders, so wide they seemed to block out the sun. The sight unsettled her more than the rifle he carried. The march stretched on without end. Birds shrieked from the canopy, startled by the rumble of boots. Insects swarmed their faces, their bites burning as sweat poured down their necks. Every sound felt magnified, the crunch of gravel, the groans of the women, the clipped English orders. Hana tried to focus on breathing evenly, but her mind wandered despite herself. She thought of Osaka, of her mother's hands kneading dough, of the quiet evenings before the war swallowed everything. Those memories felt distant, as though belonging to someone else entirely. Mariko suddenly stumbled, her knees buckling. Two Marines stepped forward, rifles ready, but she pushed herself up with a glare sharp enough to wound. "I will not fall," she hissed in Japanese, her voice ragged with pride. Hana admired her courage, even as she feared it might one day provoke consequences none of them could afford. Aiko's grip tightened around Hana's hand. "Why are they not cruel?" she whispered, eyes darting nervously toward the guards. Hana hesitated before answering. Perhaps they are saving their cruelty for later. It was safer to believe in harshness than to risk being disarmed by kindness. Yet even as she said the words, doubt gnawed at her heart. One of the Marines, a tall man with sandy hair, spoke quietly to another. Hana caught none of their words, but she heard the low chuckle that followed. Laughter here, amid all this fear, struck her like an arrow. It sounded foreign and human all at once, stirring emotions she could not name. Her shoulders sagged under exhaustion, yet she forced herself to stand straighter. If the others looked to her, she would not let them see despair. The march was endless, but so was her determination. She whispered encouragements to Aiko, soft enough that only her friend could hear. One step, then another. That is all we must do. The path curved deeper into the jungle, shadows lengthening with the setting sun. Hana's legs ached, her throat burned, but her spirit clung to one truth. This march was not the end, only the beginning of an ordeal that would test every part of who she was. And as the sound of boots pressed on, Hana realized that survival demanded more than endurance. It demanded courage she had never imagined she possessed. Night descended slowly, dragging a heavy silence across the encampment. The jungle that had raged with birds and insects during the day quieted, replaced by an eerie hum that seemed to come from the earth itself. Lanterns flickered at the edges of the marine outpost, casting pale circles of light against the dense shadows. Hana Takahashi sat with her knees drawn to her chest, the dirt cold beneath her legs, her body trembling not only from exhaustion, but from the weight of uncertainty pressing against her chest. Aiko curled beside her, head resting against Hana's shoulder, her breathing uneven. "Do you think they will harm us tonight?" she whispered, her words trembling like a fragile thread. Hana stroked her friend's hair gently. "No," she said, though she had no way of knowing. The guards' presence was constant, rifles slung over their shoulders as they paced back and forth, boots thudding softly against the ground. Their silhouettes cut against the firelight, broad and unmoving, reminders that the women were trapped between fear and the unknown. Mariko sat a short distance away, her chin raised defiantly. She glared at the guards with a look that could have burned through iron. They watch us like we are dangerous animals. Let them. I will not bow to them. Pride will not keep us alive, Hana murmured. Submission will not either, Mariko retorted, her voice sharp but low so the guards would not catch her words. The Marines, for their part, did not jeer or threaten. They moved with precision, their conversations brief, their gestures efficient. Yet their restraint was unsettling in its own way, for Hana had prepared herself for brutality, not discipline. The unknown stretched before her like a dark abyss, more frightening than clear cruelty could ever be. A guard passed close, his shadow stretching long over the dirt. Hana felt her heart leap to her throat. She lowered her eyes quickly, unwilling to meet his gaze. The sound of his boots slowed, and for a moment she feared he had stopped beside her. Instead, he shifted his rifle and continued his path. Her lungs released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The women were given no blankets, only the thin protection of their worn uniforms against the night's damp chill. Hana's teeth chattered softly, and she pulled Aiko closer. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, the emptiness a constant reminder of how vulnerable they were. Yet she forced herself to remain steady, whispering soothing words to Aiko, who fought back tears. Across the small clearing, one of the Marines crouched by the fire, speaking in a low voice to another. Hana caught fragments of their English, tones, not meanings, but in those sounds there was no venom, no mocking laughter. Just men, tired and alert, talking as soldiers do when duty chains them to long hours. Sergeant. James Miller, whose presence Hana had begun to notice more than she wished, moved with deliberate calm. He surveyed the women often, his expression unreadable, though not cruel. When Aiko began to shake harder, her sobs slipping out despite herself, his gaze lingered for a moment longer. Hana braced herself for harsh words, but none came. Instead, he adjusted his cap and turned his eyes back to the perimeter, as if choosing silence over intimidation. Hana, Aiko whimpered. I want to go home. I know, Hana said, her voice breaking before she forced strength back into it. But we must be strong together. Tomorrow will come and we will still be here. That is enough for now. Mariko scoffed softly, but she did not argue further. For all her bravado, Hana sensed that fear gnawed at her too. The night deepened, pressing in from all sides, the jungle whispering secrets the women could not understand. Hana lay back against the earth, eyes fixed on the faint glow of the stars beyond the trees. She willed herself to believe that sleep might come, though her mind raced with questions that had no answers. What awaited them in the days ahead? What kind of captivity had they entered? Her eyes closed at last, but even in restless dreams, the echo of boots and the looming presence of broad shoulders lingered, reminders that the unknown had only just begun. The morning sun arrived like an enemy, fierce and unforgiving. Hana Takahashi squinted against the harsh light as she sat up, her body stiff from the hard ground beneath her. The air was thick with the pungent odor of sweat and damp earth, and the sounds of the jungle had already begun their relentless chorus, buzzing insects, distant animal calls, the hum of nature pressing in from all sides. The Marines were already up, their movements precise as they formed their daily routines. Their broad figures moved with mechanical precision as they prepared for whatever task lay ahead. Hana's gaze lingered on them longer than she meant to, taking in their gear, their postures, the steady rhythm of their actions. There was a certain grace to the way they carried themselves, a quiet confidence that seemed to mock her sense of uncertainty. Aiko, still half asleep beside her, shifted uncomfortably. "Why do they look so calm?" she asked, her voice still fragile from the night's fear. "They have nothing to fear," Hana replied, though her words felt hollow in the oppressive heat. She did not fully understand why she spoke the truth, yet it rang in her mind with a clarity she could not ignore. Mariko, ever the skeptic, scowled as she stood, brushing the dirt from her uniform. "It's a mask, Hana. They want us to think they're invincible. But they're just men, no different from us." The morning passed without much ceremony. The Marines moved with purpose, while the women were herded like livestock to a small makeshift area near the camp. The guards remained vigilant, their eyes sweeping the area with a focus that made Hana feel as though every movement she made was being analyzed. The rations they were given were meager: stale bread, a small portion of beans, and water that tasted faintly of metal. Hana's stomach growled in protest, but she ate without complaint. She knew that complaining would only draw attention, and right now, attention was something she could not afford. Aiko hesitated before taking a bite of the bread, her eyes wide with distrust. "This doesn't taste like food," she whispered. "It's dry. Almost like dirt." "It's what we have," Hana replied quietly, her voice a mix of resignation and resolve. "We'll eat what we can." As they ate, Hana's eyes once again wandered to the Marines. She had seen them in action, and yet something about their presence, something in the way they walked, the way they spoke, struck her in a way she could not explain. They were so different from the images she had grown up with. The enemy soldiers she had imagined were faceless monsters, but these men were real, flawed, and disturbingly human. She caught sight of one of the Marines, the one with sandy hair and a strong jaw. He moved among the others with a quiet authority, and for a moment their eyes met. He did not flinch or look away, but his gaze was not one of cruelty or disdain. There was something in it, something she could not place, that made her heart race uncomfortably. The air between them was thick, charged with unspoken questions. "You're staring," Mariko muttered from beside her, snapping Hana out of her trance. "Stop looking at them. They're not worth your thoughts." Hana nodded, but a part of her could not shake the feeling that Mariko was wrong. There was more to these men than just soldiers. They were human, and they could be as confused and lost as anyone. But would they ever see the women as more than prisoners? The day dragged on slowly, each minute a reminder of their helplessness. Time seemed to stretch infinitely, but the heat, the hunger, the oppressive atmosphere of captivity weighed heavily on their minds. The women were tired, their strength drained by the combination of fear and physical exhaustion. Yet the Marines seemed unaffected, their focus unwavering. "Do you think they even understand what we're going through?" Aiko whispered after a long silence. "No," Hana answered, her voice quieter than before. "They can't. They don't know what it's like to be us." But in that moment, Hana realized something troubling. Maybe it wasn't that the Marines couldn't understand, they simply didn't need to. The world of these men was so different from hers that the idea of shared experience, of empathy, felt almost irrelevant. What could they possibly know about her life, about the woman she was before this war? Hana turned her gaze back to the Marines. Their world was defined by the discipline of battle, by the clarity of orders and the sharpness of commands. It was a world she could never fully enter, no matter how hard she tried. And yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that somehow, in some strange way, she had already begun to belong to it. The air grew heavier as the day wore on, but Hana's mind was racing. For better or worse, she was part of something far bigger than herself now. The salty wind stung Hana's face as she stood on the deck of the U.S. Navy transport ship, gripping the rusted rail with hands that were beginning to shake from exhaustion. The waves rolled in slow, unhurried rhythms, their vastness swallowing the horizon. It was impossible to tell how long they had been at sea. Time had become a blur of hunger, fatigue, and cold. Beside her, Aiko was silent, her eyes scanning the endless stretch of water with a vacant expression, lost in a world of her own thoughts. The sound of the engines hummed below, deep and constant, a constant reminder of their journey to an uncertain future. The women had been herded onto the ship in groups, their steps heavy as they were led across the gangplanks like cattle. Hana had kept her head down, focusing on one footstep after another. The uncertainty of it all left her feeling small and powerless. The air was thick with the scent of oil and metal, and the creaking of the ship was unsettling. As they were lined up below deck, Hannah could feel the eyes of the Marines on them, watching from their positions along the railing. It wasn't the hostile stare she had imagined, nor was it the indifferent gaze she had expected. It was something else, something she couldn't quite place. "Why are they watching us?" Aiko asked softly, her voice barely audible over the din of the ship. "They're keeping watch," Hannah replied, her tone flat. "We're prisoners." "But they're different. Why aren't they treating us like the enemy?" Aiko's voice cracked, and her trembling hands gripped the edge of her dress. Hannah didn't have an answer. She wished she did. In the stories told to her as a child, the enemy was faceless, brutal, heartless men who would stop at nothing to break their spirits. But the Marines surrounding them were not monsters. They were tired men, their faces lined with exhaustion, some barely younger than Hannah herself. She wondered how many had been to places like Okinawa, how many had seen the destruction their presence had caused. One of the Marines stepped closer, his boots scraping against the metal floor. His face was weathered, eyes hollow but sharp, taking in the scene around him. His gaze lingered briefly on Hannah, a flicker of something, curiosity, passing through his expression before he turned away. It was an unsettling exchange, and it left Hannah with a strange feeling in her chest, one that she couldn't articulate. This was not how war was supposed to feel. It wasn't supposed to be confusing, full of pauses and unspoken questions. Aiko broke the silence again. "Do you think they will kill us when we get to the United States?" Hannah's heart clenched at the thought. "No," she said, though her voice was unsure. "We're prisoners of war. They'll take us to a camp." "A camp?" Aiko's voice rose, a mix of confusion and fear. "What will happen there?" "I don't know," Hannah whispered. "I wish I did." The thought of what lay ahead gnawed at her, but there was little to do but endure. The ship rocked gently beneath them, the waves lapping against the sides as the sailors carried out their duties. Each minute stretched on endlessly, each moment filled with the oppressive weight of uncertainty. Hannah's eyes wandered back to the Marines who stood near the railing, their posture still and attentive. She could not help but observe the stark contrast between them and the women. The Marines were tall and broad, their bodies hard and trained by years of battle. They had the discipline of men who were used to following orders without hesitation. And yet, there was something human in them, something she hadn't expected. She shook the thought away, forcing her mind back to the present. The ship's engines hummed louder, and the movement of the water beneath them became more pronounced. The nausea of the journey had started to seep into her bones, and she felt the weight of the sea pressing in on her chest. Aiko leaned against the side of the ship, her gaze distant. The ocean seemed to stretch endlessly before them, a vast, empty expanse that mirrored the void inside Hannah's heart. What would happen when they reached land? Would they be met with open hostility? Or would they find something different, something they had never expected? There were no answers to these questions, no clear path forward. The only certainty was that the journey had only just begun. Hannah closed her eyes, trying to find some semblance of peace amidst the chaos. She clung to the one thought she could hold on to, survival. It was all she had left. The ship moved onward, slicing through the endless sea, and all Hannah could do was wait for what came next. The sight of land after days at sea was both a relief and a shock. Hana Takahashi stood at the rail of the ship, her gaze fixed on the distant shoreline that grew clearer with every passing minute. It wasn't the familiar coast of Japan, but the strange sunlit shores of Hawaii, a place she had only heard of in distant whispers and wartime broadcasts. The ocean around the ship had calmed, as if the world itself was giving them a brief respite. The air was filled with the scent of salt water and something else, something fresh, almost exotic. Hana breathed in deeply, trying to quell the churn of anxiety in her stomach. She could hear Aiko beside her, her voice tinged with disbelief. "I didn't think we'd ever see land again," Aiko whispered, her words trembling. "It feels like a dream." Hana didn't answer immediately. Instead, she watched the land approach, her mind racing with thoughts of what awaited them. The future felt like a vast, uncharted expanse, one that she couldn't navigate, no matter how much she tried to prepare herself. The ship continued its steady course toward the harbor, the tall, jagged peaks of the island rising against the sky like silent sentinels. Hannah tried to focus on the beauty of the landscape, the vibrant green of the hills, the pale golden beaches that seemed to stretch endlessly. But all she could think about was the uncertainty ahead. Around them, the Marines went about their tasks, moving with practiced ease. They were no longer just soldiers to Hannah. They were men, with faces that betrayed exhaustion and bodies that seemed weighed down by the burdens of war. As the ship neared the shore, she noticed how their movements seemed to slow, as though they too were aware of the change that was about to come. One of the Marines, a tall man with dark eyes, stood near the rail, his gaze fixed on the island as well. For a moment their eyes met, and a flicker of recognition passed between them. It was strange, a fleeting connection that Hannah couldn't understand. He wasn't looking at her with hatred or fear, but with something else, something she hadn't expected. "You're staring again," Mariko said sharply, breaking Hannah's reverie. "You need to stop." Hannah didn't respond. Instead, she looked away, focusing on the shore as the ship docked. The dock was crowded with men in military uniforms, some of them American soldiers, others who looked like civilians. They moved in a hurry, shouting orders and guiding the ship toward the harbor. The ramp descended with a heavy groan, and Hannah felt a tremor of apprehension run through her. She had seen it in the movies, American soldiers, harsh and uncaring, ready to tear the prisoners apart. But what lay before them now was an unexpected scene. The soldiers stood quietly, watching the prisoners with neutral expressions. No jeers, no mocking smiles. As the women were led off the ship, they were herded into a large holding area, a temporary camp that had been set up for them. The sun beat down relentlessly, and the heat was oppressive. But the air was different here, strange and unfamiliar. Hannah could feel the weight of the tropical climate seeping into her skin, a reminder that they were no longer on the other side of the world, in the land they had once known. The camp was not what she had imagined. There were no high fences or guard dogs. The Marines kept their distance, but their eyes were alert as if watching for something. Hannah couldn't help but wonder what they were looking for. Aiko stood beside her, trembling. "What now?" she asked in a voice barely above a whisper. Hannah didn't know. She had no answers. The future was a blank slate, and she could feel the weight of it pressing down on her. They were prisoners in a foreign land, caught between two worlds they couldn't understand. Hannah turned her gaze toward the horizon once more, her mind swirling with questions. Would they be treated as captives or as something else entirely? How would they be viewed by the people who lived here, by the Americans who had taken them from their homes? She couldn't answer, and for the first time she realized that she might never truly understand. She could only survive, one moment at a time. The Marines began to move, their commands sharp and efficient, and the women followed without protest. There was no point in resistance, no point in trying to escape what had already been decided. As they moved deeper into the camp, Hannah felt a shift, a subtle change in the air. The land was foreign, but she was still here, still alive. And for now, that was enough. The camp was a strange world unto itself, a patchwork of tents and hastily erected shelters amidst the vast, endless expanse of dry, parched land. The sun, already high in the sky, burned down mercilessly, turning the air to thick soup. Hana Takahashi could feel the heat pressing against her skin, but it was nothing compared to the weight pressing down on her chest. They were far from the chaos of the battlefield, but the reality of captivity still felt suffocating. The women were led through the camp in small groups, their feet kicking up the dry earth beneath them. Every step seemed to echo, reminding them that they were not free. They were prisoners, marked not by the uniforms they wore, but by the heavy silence that followed them everywhere. Around them, the Marines moved in steady formations, their eyes scanning the area with military precision. They were quiet, as if guarding against something, but Hana couldn't tell if it was fear or something else that had frozen them into such disciplined stillness. Hana noticed something strange as they were directed to a corner of the camp. The Marines didn't shout at them, didn't demand anything in the way she expected. Some of them avoided their eyes entirely, as if unsure of what to do with them. Others, though, glanced at the women with fleeting curiosity, before quickly looking away, as if they were afraid of acknowledging their humanity. She was assigned to a small, cramped space, its walls made of canvas stretched taut over wooden poles. Inside, there were thin mats on the floor, which offered no comfort against the coldness of the earth beneath. The air smelled faintly of mildew, and the light was dim, casting long shadows across the room. The women settled into the area, Aiko and Mariko beside her. "We have to survive this," Aiko whispered, her voice cracking. "But how?" Hana didn't have an answer. She could feel the weight of her own uncertainty settling in her stomach, a constant gnawing reminder that they were so far from anything resembling safety. The camp was a holding pen, a temporary stop on a journey none of them had chosen. As she lay down, she could hear the sounds of the camp filtering through the thin walls of their tent. The distant clatter of pots and pans, the sound of footsteps, the low murmur of voices, some in English, some in languages she didn't understand. But it was the silence between the sounds that unsettled her most, the quiet that seemed to stretch out endlessly. Later that day, the women were called out for their first group inspection. They stood in line, their eyes downcast, as a Marine with a clipboard began his walk along the row. He moved without speaking, his gaze scanning each woman as though cataloguing them. The women stiffened, their bodies tense, but no one dared to protest. They had learned early on that silence was the only thing that might shield them. When the Marine came to her, he paused for a moment, his gaze lingering on her face. For a brief moment their eyes met, his expression unreadable. It was a strange exchange, one that made Hana's heart race, though she didn't know why. It wasn't hostile, but it wasn't warm either, it was simply neutral. He scribbled something on his clipboard and moved on, leaving her standing there, her thoughts swirling. What had he seen in her? Did it matter? She wasn't sure, but she couldn't help feeling that the brief moment of contact had exposed something deeper, a reminder that they were not invisible, not entirely forgotten. The day passed slowly, filled with monotonous routines. The women were given small rations, mostly bread, a small portion of vegetables, and a thin soup that barely filled the hollow in their stomachs. The food was not enough to sate their hunger, but it was all they had. As Hana sat on the dirt floor of their tent later that night, her mind continued to race. It was hard to believe that just a few weeks ago, her life had been so different, so full of purpose and certainty. Now she was here, trapped in a foreign land, unsure of what awaited her next. Mariko was the first to speak. "We can't just sit here and wait for them to decide our fate." Hana didn't reply right away. What was there to say? "We need to fight back," Mariko insisted. "Even if it's just with our words, we can resist." Hana turned to her, her voice quiet but firm. "And what would that do? We're alone here. No one will listen to us." Aiko shuddered beside them, her eyes wide with fear. "We have to be strong," she whispered. "We can't lose hope." Hana nodded slowly, though she wasn't sure what strength could come from something so fragile. She didn't have the answers. All she could do was endure. The quiet of the night stretched on, and with it Hana's thoughts, tangled and uncertain. She wondered, for the 1,000th time, what was waiting for them beyond the walls of this camp. It started with a whisper, a low, harsh murmur that spread through the camp like wildfire. Mariko's voice was sharp, her frustration and anger igniting something inside her that could not be quelled. "We are not animals," she hissed, her words meant for the others, but loud enough to carry across the crowded space. Hana glanced up, startled. Mariko's eyes flashed with defiance, her back straight, her fists clenched at her sides. The woman's figure, once subdued by fear, now stood tall and full of anger. "Shh, Mariko, quiet," Aiko murmured, her voice trembling. "The guards will hear." But Mariko wasn't listening. She paced back and forth in their small, confined space. "We've been shoved into this camp like cattle. We deserve more than this." Her eyes burned with an intensity that was unmistakable. "We have rights. We have dignity." Hana sat silently, her chest tightening as Mariko's words filled the space. She knew better than anyone the pain of captivity, the humiliation of being treated as less than human. But she also knew the dangers of provoking the soldiers. Something inside her told her that defiance would only invite trouble. "It's not about dignity," Hana said quietly, careful not to provoke Mariko further. "It's about survival. The Marines have the power. We have to be careful." "Careful?" Mariko spat, her voice rising. "You're telling me to hide in the shadows and wait for them to decide our fate. That's not survival, Hana, that's submission." Hana's heart raced. She understood the anger, the frustration. It mirrored her own feelings, but she couldn't bring herself to act on them. Survival meant more than just avoiding conflict. It meant navigating the unknown with restraint. The tension in their small area was palpable, the air thick with unspoken words and emotions, too complex for any of them to fully understand. Hana could feel the heat rising in her chest as she fought to maintain her calm. Suddenly, one of the Marines stepped into view, his broad form framed by the flap of their tent. His presence was like a sudden gust of wind, and all conversations ceased in an instant. He looked down at the women, his eyes scanning the group with an unreadable expression. Mariko took a step forward, her chin tilted up defiantly. "What do you want from us?" she demanded. The Marine didn't answer immediately. His eyes lingered on her for a moment too long, and Hana held her breath, fearing the worst. But then he spoke, his voice flat but not without a hint of something softer, perhaps curiosity, perhaps hesitation. "Just stay quiet," he said, his gaze shifting to the other women. "No more trouble." Hana could see that the others were on edge, their fear tangible in the way they shrunk back, instinctively moving closer to one another. Mariko, however, didn't flinch. "We're not your prisoners," she retorted. "We're human beings. You can't treat us like this." The Marine took a deep breath, his jaw tightening. But before he could respond, another soldier appeared, and with a curt command, the first Marine turned on his heel and walked away, disappearing into the haze of the camp. The silence that followed was deafening. Mariko stood there, her chest heaving with the force of her anger, her eyes flashing with something that wasn't fear, but something close to it. Defiance, yes, but also a deep, buried terror. "What do we do now?" Aiko asked, her voice small, as if she feared the answer. Hana didn't have an answer. Her mind was racing, torn between the urge to support Mariko's fiery spirit and the realization that this could easily escalate into something much worse. "We wait," Hana finally said, her voice steady despite the tremor running through her. "We stay quiet, and we wait. It's all we can do." But even as she said the words, Hana couldn't help but wonder, how long could they wait? How long could they endure this slow erosion of their humanity? How long before they, too, would snap? Mariko glared at her, the fire in her eyes still burning bright. "You think this will last forever? You think they won't break us?" "I think we have no choice but to survive," Hana said softly, meeting her friend's gaze. "And for now, surviving means holding back." For a moment, the silence stretched out between them, heavy and thick with unspoken frustrations. Hana could feel the weight of the situation pressing on her shoulders, pulling her in every direction. She wanted to believe in Mariko's fire, in the power of defiance, but the fear that lived in the corners of her heart told her that survival was a more fragile thing than that. "We survive," she said again, though it was a promise she wasn't sure she could keep. The day passed in a blur of routine. The tension between the women was palpable, a quiet undercurrent that ran through everything they did. It wasn't just the presence of the Marines that kept them in check. It was the fear that they had no control over their fate. But Mariko's words had left their mark. Hana couldn't forget them, couldn't shake the feeling that perhaps she had been wrong to suppress her own anger, to hide behind the walls of silence. If they were human beings, then perhaps they deserved more than silence. Perhaps, someday, they would find a way to fight back, not with violence, but with strength. For now, though, survival was all that mattered. The scent of paper and ink filled the air, as Hana Takahashi sat on the edge of her thin mat, staring at the blank sheet in front of her. The pen in her hand felt foreign, its weight strange in her grip, as if she had never held it before. The camp was quieter than usual that morning, with most of the women either resting or waiting for the daily tasks to begin. But Hana had been given a rare opportunity, a chance to write a letter. It was a privilege, she knew, though it felt more like a cruel reminder of all she had lost. Her fingers hovered over the page, uncertain of what to say. The words, if they came, would be heavily censored, the meaning of her message reduced to a whisper. She thought of her mother, who would likely receive nothing but a few words of reassurance, a false promise that everything was fine. I am alive. We are safe. These were the words she would write, words that felt empty, but necessary. She couldn't risk telling her mother the truth. She couldn't bear the thought of her parents worrying about things they could not control. Aiko sat beside her face pale and distant as she too held a letter, her eyes filled with unshed tears. Hana could feel the sadness radiating from her friend, but Aiko said nothing. "It's hard, isn't it?" Aiko whispered, breaking the silence. Her voice was soft, a fragile thread. Hana nodded, glancing at Aiko. To write the truth would be to break her heart. "It's easier to lie." "I don't want to lie," Aiko said, her hands shaking as she clenched the paper. "But how can I say anything else?" Hana looked down at her own letter, the words that had been written in her mind, suddenly feeling inadequate, useless. Her heart ached, but she wrote anyway. "I am well. We are treated well here." She wrote, the words hollow, and yet they felt like the only thing she could offer. It was as if the act of writing itself, of placing her emotions onto paper, would somehow lessen the burden of the lie. Mariko, sitting across from them, looked up from her own letter, her brow furrowed in concentration. Her pen moved quickly, aggressively, as though each stroke was a fight. "You shouldn't tell them that," she said, her voice carrying an edge. "They're not fools. They will know you're lying. What's the point?" Hana's pen paused, her eyes meeting Mariko's. "What else can I say? What would be the point of the truth? We're prisoners. They'll never hear from us again." Mariko slammed her pen down on the ground. "Then let them know. Let them know we're being held here. Let them know what's happening." She stood abruptly, the force of her movement startling the others. "Why are we pretending? Why are we waiting?" Hana stood quickly to quiet her, but the anger that Mariko had been holding in for so long now seemed to consume her. She could see the fire in her eyes, and for a moment Hana almost believed that she might say something dangerous, something that could bring even more harm. "Aiko, stop her!" Hana urged, her voice sharp with panic. But Aiko, her face pale and drawn, just shook her head. I can't. She's right. We shouldn't be hiding it. We shouldn't lie." Mariko's gaze softened when she saw Aiko's expression. She sank back down onto the mat, her shoulders heavy with the weight of her own fury. "I don't want to lie. I don't want them to think we've forgotten who we are." Hana sat down again, feeling the intensity of the moment wash over her. She understood the desire to speak out, to tell the world what had happened to them, but the cost of that was too high. There was no way to escape it. No way to erase the consequences. The quiet tension stretched for a long while before Hana finally spoke, her voice softer than before. "We have to survive, Mariko. That's what matters." Mariko didn't answer, but she didn't need to. They all knew what was at stake. Hana could see the flicker of understanding in her friend's eyes. Resistance wasn't just about fighting back. It was about something more, something bigger than words. "I'll finish my letter," Hana said finally, her voice steady. "And I'll send it. But I'll tell her what I must. The rest can wait." The silence that followed was heavy, but it felt more peaceful than the tension before it. Mariko didn't say anything more, and Aiko simply nodded, folding her letter carefully. They all knew there were more things unsaid between them than they could ever write. Hana finished her letter and handed it to the Marine who came by to collect them, a brief, almost ritualistic exchange that passed without comment. The truth would never be known, not completely, but at least the words had been written, and for now that would have to be enough. It started with a cough, a dry, hollow sound that broke the stillness of the camp. Hana Takahashi was the first to hear it, the rasping echo cutting through the heavy heat of the midday air. At first, she thought it was just a one-time thing, but then it came again, and again. She turned to see Aiko, her small frame curled up against the canvas wall of their tent, her face pale and flushed with fever. Her breath was shallow, her eyes glazed with fatigue. Hana's heart sank as she moved quickly to her friend's side. "Aiko," she whispered, her hand gently touching Aiko's forehead. It was burning with fever. "Aiko, what's wrong?" Aiko's eyes fluttered open, a weak smile flickering across her face. "I'm fine," she mumbled, but the lie was evident in her voice. "It's nothing. I just need some rest." Hana's hands trembled as she felt Aiko's temperature rise. The heat radiating from her was too intense to ignore. Panic surged through her, but she fought to keep her composure. The camp was not equipped to handle illness, and medical care was a luxury they did not have. "Aiko, you're not fine," Hana said, her voice soft but firm. "We need to tell someone. You're sick. You need help." But Aiko shook her head weakly, her hand brushing away Hana's. "No, I don't want to be a burden. We've all suffered enough." Hana's chest tightened. The pride, the refusal to admit weakness, it was a trait they had all learned to carry like a shield. But right now, it was doing Aiko no favors. Without another word, Hana stood up and moved toward the entrance of the tent. The air outside was hot, and the sun beat down relentlessly, but it didn't matter. She needed help. She found one of the Marines standing nearby, his rifle slung over his shoulder. He didn't seem to notice her at first, his gaze fixed on the horizon. But when she approached, he looked down at her, his expression unreadable. "I need help," Hana said, her voice barely a whisper. "My friend is sick. She's burning with fever." The Marine hesitated, his eyes scanning her face before nodding. "I'll get the medic," he said, turning on his heel without another word. Hana stood still, her heart hammering in her chest as she returned to the tent. Aiko was barely conscious now, her breathing ragged and labored. Hana sat beside her, taking her hand in her own. "Aiko, please hold on," Hana whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "The medic will be here soon." "You're going to be fine." But Aiko's response was a faint murmur, her eyelids fluttering as if she were fighting to stay awake. The minutes stretched on, an eternity in the oppressive heat. The sounds of the camp faded into the background, replaced by the dull roar of worry in Hana's chest. Time seemed to bend and warp as she waited for the medic to arrive, her thoughts racing through 1,000 possible outcomes, none of them good. Finally, the Marine returned, this time with a man in uniform who appeared to be a medic. He was tall and wiry, with sharp eyes and a practiced calm. Without speaking, he knelt beside Aiko, quickly assessing her condition. His hands were sure, efficient as he took her pulse and checked her breathing. "She's got a fever," the medic muttered. "But it's not too late. We'll need to get her fluids." The words were a relief, but they didn't ease the weight in Hana's chest. There was no guarantee that Aiko would be all right. The medic didn't have the equipment to properly treat a fever of this scale. He was doing the best he could, but the reality was cruel. Hana watched as the medic prepared a makeshift IV, his movements quick and precise. Aiko's body was still limp, her skin pale under the harsh light. Hana's thoughts spun as she held Aiko's hand tighter. "You're going to be fine," Hana repeated softly, though she wasn't sure if it was more for Aiko's sake or her own. "Just hold on." Minutes passed in silence, the only sound the soft murmuring of the medic as he worked. Aiko's fever seemed to relent, just slightly, but it was still too early to tell if the worst had passed. As the medic packed up his supplies, he gave Hana a look, one she couldn't quite interpret. He didn't speak, but his eyes told her everything she needed to know. "She'll be okay," he said finally, giving a quick nod before walking away. "For now." Hana sat there for a long time, her hand still clutching Aiko's, her body numb with relief and fear. The hours dragged by, but for the first time since the fever had set in, Hana allowed herself to hope. Aiko was still alive. And for that, Hana would keep fighting. Days passed, and Aiko's fever began to subside. The medic had come and gone, and though there was no guarantee, Hana allowed herself to believe that her friend might pull through. It was a fragile hope, one she held close, and never dared to speak aloud. In the silence of the tent, the constant rustle of the camp and the distant hum of voices, there was a small but steady sense of relief that she clung to. Aiko, now conscious and more lucid, had begun to drink small amounts of water and eat the sparse rations they were provided. Her eyes still held a dullness, but the strength that Hana had always known in her friend was slowly returning. Yet, something had changed in Aiko, something deeper than the physical toll the fever had taken. "You should rest," Hana urged gently, helping Aiko sit up against the wall of the tent. Her hands were steady, though her heart fluttered with concern as she adjusted the thin blanket over Aiko's shoulders. "I'm fine," Aiko murmured, though her voice still held the faintest tremor. She looked out into the distance as if searching for something beyond the confines of their camp. "I thought I was going to die, Hana." The words hung between them, heavy and undeniable. Hana nodded, though the weight of those words felt too much to bear. "You're here now. You're alive." Aiko's gaze flickered back to her, a flicker of uncertainty passing through her eyes. "But for how long?" she whispered. "How much longer can we survive like this?" Hana couldn't answer. The truth was too raw, too painful. She had no idea how much longer they would be trapped in the limbo of captivity. How many more days of hunger and uncertainty could they endure before they too would break? Yet, despite the dread that threatened to overwhelm her, Hana found herself returning to a single truth. They were alive. She couldn't lose sight of that. For Aiko, for Mariko, for herself, survival meant more than mere existence. It meant clinging to every shred of humanity left. The sound of boots crunching against gravel interrupted her thoughts. Hana turned instinctively, her gaze falling on the Marine approaching their tent. It was Sergeant Miller, the one whose presence had been a constant in the camp. His broad shoulders were tense, his gaze scanning the area, but today there was something different in the way he looked at the women. As he came closer, his eyes met Hana's, and for the briefest moment, she saw something she hadn't expected. A glimmer of recognition, of understanding, but it was gone in an instant, replaced by the sternness that came with his role. He stopped in front of the tent, looking down at Aiko with a measured expression. "How's she doing?" he asked, his voice quiet, almost gentle. His gaze never lingered too long, as if afraid to acknowledge something beyond the professional distance required. Hana stood a little straighter, meeting his eyes. "She's recovering," she said, her voice firm. "But I don't know how long she'll be stable." Sergeant Miller nodded, his jaw clenched. "Keep her hydrated. We'll check on her again soon." Hana felt an unfamiliar weight settle in her chest as she watched him turn away. There was something about the way he spoke, the brief moment of concern that had softened his usually cold demeanor, that made her question everything she thought she knew about these men. The Marines who guarded them, who held their lives in their hands, were not the monsters she had been taught to fear. They too were human with their own burdens and struggles. Her thoughts were interrupted when Mariko appeared from the corner of the tent, her eyes hard, but her voice quieter than usual. "Why does he care?" she asked, her words laced with suspicion. "What does it matter to him?" "I don't know," Hana admitted. "But it's strange, isn't it?" Mariko sat down beside Aiko, her eyes still watching the distant figure of Sergeant Miller as he spoke to another soldier. "It's all a game, a manipulation. Don't trust them, Hana. They're still the enemy." Hana hesitated, her heart heavy with the truth of Mariko's words. It was hard to dismiss the anger and the sense of betrayal that lay in her friend's voice. But still, something about Sergeant Miller's presence gnawed at her. Perhaps he wasn't what she expected, and perhaps he wasn't as indifferent as he seemed. "We're alive," Hana said softly, her voice steady. "That's enough for now." Mariko said nothing in response, but the silence between them was telling. It was an agreement, and yet an unspoken divide between the two of them, a divide that only grew as they navigated their strange new existence in the camp. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Hana sat quietly beside Aiko, the weight of the day pressing down on her. She didn't know what the future would bring, but in that moment, surrounded by the warmth of her friends and the quiet sense of survival, she felt the fragile thread of hope begin to take root once more. And for the first time since their capture, she allowed herself to believe that perhaps against all odds, they could make it through this. The whispers started slowly, barely audible amidst the hum of daily camp life. At first, Hana had dismissed them, rumors, nothing more than idle chatter. But as the days passed, the murmur grew louder. The war was ending. Japan was losing. Hana stood outside the tent, staring into the distance, her mind trying to process the words that had slipped into the air around her. They didn't come from the Marines. No, they came from the women, those who had been in captivity the longest. Those who had seen the shifts in the air felt the tides of change. But how could it be true? How could this nightmare of captivity, this foreign land, possibly be ending? The sun beat down mercilessly, its heat reflecting off the dust-ridden ground. The camp had always felt like a prison, this small, sun-scorched patch of earth where the women were trapped, their lives put on hold by the brutality of war. They had learned to endure the days, the routine, the slow passing of time without any hope of change. But now, with every passing hour, a new tension filled the air. It was as though the world itself had shifted, leaving them waiting, wondering, uncertain of what was next. Was it possible? "Aiko," Hana called softly, her voice betraying a trace of the uncertainty she felt. Her friend sat against the canvas wall of their tent, her face still pale from the fever, but her eyes bright with the faintest flicker of hope. She had been recovering steadily, though she was still weak. Aiko looked up at her, blinking slowly. "What is it, Hana?" Hana hesitated before speaking. "The rumors about the war. Do you think they're true?" Aiko's gaze turned distant as if searching for an answer she could not find. "I don't know," she whispered, her voice wavering. "I hope so. I've heard the soldiers talking. Some of them seem different. They're not as harsh. I think they know something is changing." Hana's heart pounded, a mixture of fear and disbelief coursing through her. Could the war really be ending? Could they really be returning home? Or was it just another cruel hope, another lie to keep them tethered to this place? Mariko emerged from the shadows of the tent, her expression unreadable as always. She hadn't said a word to Hana since their argument about survival and defiance. Her eyes narrowed as she glanced between Aiko and Hana. "You believe that?" she asked sharply, her tone mocking. "You think they'll let us go just because the war is over? We're prisoners. Nothing changes that." Hana looked at her, startled by the bitterness in her voice. "I want to believe it, Mariko. I have to." "There's nothing to believe in," Mariko spat, her words laced with frustration. "You think they'll just let us walk out of here? We're not their concern anymore. The war is over, yes, but what does that mean for us?" Hana bit her lip, feeling the weight of her friend's words. It wasn't that she hadn't thought of the possibility. What did the end of the war really mean for them? Would they be freed, or would they just be forgotten, left to linger in the same place they'd been for so long? Aiko interrupted the tension with a soft sigh, her eyes filled with a quiet sadness. "We have to hold on to hope, Mariko. It's all we have left." Mariko turned away, crossing her arms over her chest. "Hope doesn't change reality," she muttered. Hana's heart sank, but she refused to let the doubt creep in. She couldn't. For Aiko's sake, for her own, she had to believe that the rumors were true, that this nightmare was finally ending. Aiko shifted slightly, her voice quieter now. "Maybe we'll go back to Japan, to our families." She sounded unsure, as though the thought had never seemed so far away. Hana nodded, a small but genuine smile crossing her lips. "Maybe we will. Maybe we'll go home." But even as she said the words, she couldn't quite shake the doubt that lingered at the edges of her mind. The end of the war would bring with it a flood of changes, and they couldn't predict what it would mean for them. Would they be able to leave this place, or would they remain trapped in the shadow of a war they had no control over? For a moment, everything felt like it was hanging in the balance, too fragile to hold, yet too important to ignore. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the camp, Hana allowed herself to hope just a little longer, because even in the midst of all this uncertainty, it was the only thing she had left. "Tomorrow," she whispered, "we'll find out." and for the first time in a long time, she felt the stirrings of something more than fear. It was the beginning of belief, fragile and tentative, but a belief nonetheless. The news came quietly, carried on the whisper of a breeze and the shifting of boots on the dry earth. It started as a rumor, but like all rumors, it spread fast, its shadow reaching every corner of the camp. The war was over. Japan had surrendered. Hana Takahashi sat motionless, her heart pounding as she processed the words. She had heard the hushed conversations, seen the exchanged glances between the Marines, their faces unreadable, but filled with something that might have been relief, or something else. Aiko was the first to react, her face pale with disbelief. "It's over," she whispered, as if saying the words aloud could make them real. Hana looked at her, her voice tight with uncertainty. "That's what they're saying. The war it's ended." The world outside their small tent seemed to shift, as if everything around them was suddenly quieter. The camp, once a place of tension and fear, now felt different, as though the air had lightened ever so slightly. Hana didn't know what it meant for them. Would they be freed? Would they return home? Mariko, however, was silent. Her eyes narrowed as she processed the information. It wasn't the relief that Hana had expected to see in her friend's eyes. Instead, there was something darker, a quiet suspicion. "Do you think they'll let us go?" Aiko asked, her voice hopeful but tinged with doubt. "Do you think we'll be sent back to Japan?" Mariko's response came quickly, sharp and unyielding. "It doesn't matter," she said, her tone flat. "We're still prisoners. Just because the war is over doesn't mean anything changes for us." Hana frowned, glancing at her. "But Mariko—" "No, Hana, don't you get it?" Mariko snapped, her eyes blazing. "They'll put us somewhere else, forget about us, or worse. Just because the war ended doesn't mean they'll suddenly start treating us like people again." Hana could feel the sting of Mariko's words, but she couldn't bring herself to let the hope go. Not yet. She turned her gaze toward the Marines who stood at the edge of the camp, speaking among themselves in low voices. She could see them looking at each other with a sort of tentative relief, as though waiting for orders that had not yet come. The silence that followed Mariko's words felt heavy. Aiko shifted beside Hana, wrapping her arms around herself, as though she could shield herself from the uncertainty hanging in the air. I think we should wait," Hana said quietly, her voice soft but steady. "We don't know what's going to happen yet, but we have to stay calm. It's not over until they say it's over." But even as she spoke, Hana couldn't stop the flood of emotions that threatened to overwhelm her. The thought of going home, of seeing her family again, seemed so far away. Could they really be released? Or was this just another cruel twist of fate, another promise that would be broken? The hours passed in a blur of waiting and uncertainty. The camp buzzed with the same low hum, but now there was a sense of hesitation in the air. The women exchanged nervous glances, each one unsure of what to do with the possibility that had suddenly opened before them. Mariko sat in the corner of their tent, her face unreadable, her thoughts hidden behind a mask of stoicism. Aiko, on the other hand, couldn't contain her excitement. "Do you think we'll be on the next ship home?" she asked, her eyes shining with the promise of a future she had never allowed herself to imagine. Hana didn't answer immediately, her thoughts swirling. The war was over, but what did that mean for them? Would the Marines simply send them back, or would they be forgotten, left behind in some distant corner of the world? As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the camp, Hana found herself lost in the possibilities. She wanted to believe it was over, that they were finally free, but she knew better than to trust in something so fragile. "Tomorrow," she said, the words leaving her lips before she could stop them. "Tomorrow we'll know more." And with that, she let herself cling to the hope that perhaps, just perhaps, the nightmare was finally coming to an end. The morning came too soon, as though time itself had decided to stretch and linger for just a little while longer. The air was heavy with humidity, and the camp, which had seemed tense and restless the day before, now hummed with a different energy. Whispers had spread quickly that the women would soon be repatriated, shipped back to Japan, to their families, to the life they had once known. Hana Takahashi sat on the edge of her mat, staring out at the dusty clearing in front of their tent. The morning was still, the usual sounds of the camp muted, as if everyone was waiting for something to happen. The Marines were more present today, their movements purposeful and hurried. There was a palpable change in the atmosphere, nervous anticipation mixed with disbelief, as if no one quite knew what to do with the sudden shift. Beside her, Aiko was quietly packing her few belongings, her movements slow but deliberate. She hadn't said much that morning, but her smile, the one that had been absent for so long, was finally starting to show again. "I can't believe it," Aiko said softly, her voice still carrying the remnants of her illness. "Are we really going home?" Hana turned to look at her, unsure how to answer. "I hope so. I really do." She didn't want to voice the lingering doubt that had taken root in her heart. What if it wasn't true? What if they were just moving them to another camp, to another place where they would wait, indefinitely? Mariko, who had been silent for the past few days, stood in the doorway of the tent, her eyes scanning the camp with a mix of wariness and resignation. "Don't get your hopes up," she said, her voice clipped. "This isn't over, not yet." Hana felt the sting of Mariko's words, but she didn't respond. She couldn't. Not now. Not when everything inside her was clinging to the fragile thread of hope that maybe, just maybe, this nightmare was finally coming to an end. As the day wore on, the camp grew busier, with Marines coordinating logistics, loading supplies, and preparing for what was to come. The women were herded into groups, told to pack what little they had and prepare for a journey. They were given new instructions, their movements more controlled now, but still there was an undercurrent of uncertainty. Hana found herself walking beside Aiko as they followed the others to the designated area. She could feel her pulse quicken with each step, her thoughts racing ahead of her. Would they really be sent home? Could they actually be free from the prison of this camp? "They're not just going to let us go," Mariko muttered under her breath, catching up to them. "They'll use us for something else." "You'll see." "I don't care," Hana said, her voice louder than she intended. "I just want to go home. I just want to see my family again." Aiko smiled weakly at that, but it didn't reach her eyes. Her exhaustion was still evident, though her strength was slowly returning. Hana could see it in the way she moved, in the way she held herself a little taller each day. As the women were lined up, the Marines began giving them final instructions, their voices sharp and concise. The tension in the air was palpable, and Hana could sense that everyone was waiting for the first real sign that they were truly being released. The sound of a truck's engine rumbled in the distance, the promise of departure seeming just on the horizon. A few minutes later, the first truck pulled into view. It was a military vehicle, its wheels kicking up dust as it came to a stop. The Marines stood at attention, their faces stern, but there was something in their posture that seemed different, less rigid, less tense. Hana's heart leapt at the sight of the truck. This was it. They were going. "We're really leaving," Aiko whispered, her voice full of wonder. Mariko, still guarded, shook her head. "Let's see if we're really going home first," she muttered. As they climbed into the truck, the weight of the moment settled over Hana. She looked out over the camp one last time, taking in the faces of the other women, their expressions a mixture of hope and disbelief. The soldiers, their guards, their captors, these figures that had loomed over them for so long, were now a fading presence, a shadow in the rearview mirror. For the first time in a long while, Hana allowed herself to breathe deeply, her chest rising and falling with each exhale. The future, though uncertain, stretched out before her like an open road, filled with both fear and possibility. But for now it didn't matter. They were leaving, and that was enough. The journey back to Japan was quiet, marked only by the hum of the truck's engine and the occasional rustle of the women in the back. Hana sat near the edge, staring out at the passing landscape, trying to focus on the horizon, but her mind refused to settle. It was as if she was waiting for something, a moment that would make sense of everything, that would tie up all the loose ends. But that moment hadn't come yet. The road stretched ahead of them, endless and uncertain. The truck bounced over the uneven terrain, and the sun beat down fiercely. But Hana didn't feel the heat anymore. Her thoughts were too heavy. too full of the weight of the past months, the fear, the pain, the hunger. She had been here so long that the idea of leaving, of returning home, seemed unreal. Aiko sat beside her, her face turned toward the window, her expression far away. The girl who had once been full of laughter and warmth was now quiet, subdued by the trauma of captivity. But Hana could see the flicker of hope in her eyes, that same quiet hope that had begun to grow the day they had first heard the news of the war's end. A hope that maybe, just maybe, there was something more to their future than survival. "We're going home," Aiko said softly, the words almost a whisper, as if saying them too loudly might shatter the fragile reality they had begun to accept. Hana nodded, though the thought of home didn't feel as comforting as she had imagined. The Japan they were returning to was not the one she had left behind. The war had torn everything apart. The streets would be different. Her family would be different. She would be different. Mariko, sitting across from them, spoke for the first time in hours. Her voice was strained, tired. "Do you think they'll recognize us? Will they even want us back?" Her words landed like stones in the silence, heavy and unsettling. Hana turned to her, the familiar ache of fear and doubt still echoing in Mariko's voice. "They'll recognize us," Hana said, her tone firmer than she felt. "We're still their daughters. We still have a place." Mariko didn't respond. She simply looked out at the passing landscape, her face unreadable. The war had stolen so much from them all, but it hadn't stolen their memories. Their families, their homes, their lives before the war were still out there somewhere. And for better or worse, they would return to them. The journey seemed to take forever, as if the truck was moving in slow motion, dragging them through time. Hana's eyes grew heavy with exhaustion, but sleep never fully came. Her mind was too full of questions, too full of the faces of the women who had become her family, too full of the ghosts of everything she had lost. The truck finally slowed as it neared a military base, somewhere on the outskirts of what they would call their new reality. Soldiers in uniform stood waiting, their faces indifferent but watchful. When the truck stopped, the women were ordered to disembark, their movements slow and careful. The air was thick with tension, but it was the kind of tension that came from waiting for the next moment, the next command. Hana stepped down from the truck, her feet hitting the ground with a dull thud. For the first time in months, she felt the ground beneath her in a way that was different, not as a symbol of captivity, but as the ground that would lead her home. But even as she stood there, she knew that the road ahead was no simpler than the one that had brought her here. Aiko moved next to her, her hand slipping into Hana's as they stood in line, waiting for instructions. Mariko walked a little behind them, her shoulders rigid, her eyes scanning the area. "Do you think it will be the same?" Aiko asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Hana didn't know how to answer. The world they were going back to wasn't the same as the one they had left. Their lives had been changed, shaped by the war, and there was no returning to innocence. There was no going back to the life they had before it all, but as Hana looked out at the horizon, she saw something. A flicker of the past, a trace of the world she had known, hidden in the shadows of the present. Maybe it wasn't the same, but that didn't mean they couldn't find their place in it again, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough.